What an honor.
And why don't the two of you also already sit here? Yeah, you can sit here. Enjoy the view. So, once again, Sie haben das Wort.
Herzlichen Dank. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. What an honor. It's not only me being invited to this important committee and this hearing, but also me being able to speak up here, which is a place that I typically just watch on TV. I'm on TV now, which is even better. Thanks very much for the great honor and the pleasure to be here. Whilst we're getting set up here, can I just ask who among people in the room thinks Nordstream 2 is a bad deal? Can you just please raise your hands? Nordstream 2 being a bad deal for Europe. Okay. Who among you would think it's because of economics? Can you raise your hand? Okay. And who would think it's because of politics? All right. Here we go. So, well, I think, I mean, obviously you're in good comp. Well, let me see whether that for some reason doesn't work. Wait a sec. Let me quickly see whether that works.
Probably have to do it from there.
No, I can't. No. Can someone help me? All right. So the point is obviously, you know, the opinion in this room and in this committee obviously reflects what has been going on in terms of public debates. Joe Biden, you know, now former vice president of the US, called Nord Stream 2 a bad deal for Europe. It was not only political, it was meant to be no, this doesn't work. It was this doesn't work.
Where do you have to?
Okay, it goes.
No, it doesn't. So it was meant to be an economic statement as well. We have wonderful, thank you. Where do I put? Oh, okay, very good, thank you. My apologies. There is, as Mr. Chairman has pointed out, there's talks among the senior management in the European Commission about energy security being decreased by Nord Stream 2. There is a lot of mumbling about geopolitical consequences, and on top, there have been a lot of talks and indeed debates about the legal side of things and to what extent EU energy law might be applicable to Nord Stream 2 and to what extent Nord Stream 2 is indeed subject to European law. Now, I've been asked to talk a little bit more about the economics of all this, and I'll also touch a little bit upon the legal side of the aspect of the project and leave the geopolitics to my colleagues here on the panel. But first of all, obviously, we've got to clarify a little bit what the project is all about. I know you're familiar with Nord Stream 2. In general, obviously, it's a 55 BCM pipeline that will complement an existing 55 BCM pipeline, bringing, in the end, if things go as planned by Gazprom, bringing about 110 BCM of gas into the European Union. Just to compare this to some markets, Germany, which is the biggest market on the continent, is a 90 BCM market. So essentially, you could supply Germany, Poland, and probably the Baltics with that pipeline alone. It's built by Gazprom. That was different until December 2016, when 5 European companies were still part of the consortium. This changed because of the Polish Merger Authority vetoing, essentially, the joint venture. And now Gazprom is moving ahead, regardless, and says it will build the project, and the project is on time. Steel has been bought. The pipes are being produced, if you follow the statements coming out of Moscow, and that's where we stand. Now, what does Nord Stream 2 possibly to markets, and gas markets particularly? In order to understand that, it might actually be a good idea to look at what Nord Stream 1 did, which is in operation since 5-6 years, and it has indeed changed the way European gas markets function. What I plotted here essentially is gas flows in Europe. So what you see is essentially gas flows from the west to the east going down. That's Ukraine. On top, the graph going a little bit south, further into the timeline. And at the same time, that brownish graph, the brownish line going up, that's Nord Stream. So essentially, Nord Stream indeed reduced gas flows through Ukraine, which was exactly what Gazprom had intended to do, and which is, by the way, also what Nord Stream 2 is supposed to do even more. So the idea is essentially to work without Ukraine as a transit country by 2019, when the last remaining long-term contract runs out. But there is a second thing that happened, which is very interesting, because the moment Nord Stream gas came into continental Europe, landing at the Baltic Sea of Germany, it started to compete with gas from Norway, it started to compete with gas from LNG, from liquefied natural gas, and all of this happened in an increasingly competitive market environment, which was pushed by several European legislative acts, including the Third Energy Package of 2009. So what happens is essentially that Gazprom gas started to compete with other sources of gas, and in fact started to outcompete gas coming from the east through the Ukraine. So what we saw, and actually what you see in this graph, we saw all of a sudden Czech Republic, Slovakia, and even Ukraine sourcing gas from the west rather than the east. And why is this? Well, it's because that gas was cheaper. It was hub-traded gas. So you get this ironic situation where Russian molecules from the west compete with Russian molecules from the east. And guess who loses out? Russian molecules. It's essentially the ones that were coming in cheaper that were bought by consumers and traders in Central Eastern Europe. That was facilitated by physical infrastructure that was built in order to interconnect national gas markets. And we sit on a pretty decent amount of BCMs of interconnecting capacity these days, essentially connecting Central Eastern European markets with Western European markets. A third point that comes up in that context, all of a sudden Eastern European markets started to be integrated more or less with West European hubs. So Gazpool, the Central East European gas trading hub in Baumgarten and others, started to exert pricing effects into Eastern Europe. Now, that's what a colleague of mine, Jack Sharples, called the law of unintended consequences. Essentially, Gazprom, by serving Central European gas markets through Nord Stream, started to outcompete itself and to alter the way it has to do business in Europe. Now, there is another element to this, which is it's not only gas competing with gas and gas competition that started to exert effects, but it's also the sheer optionality of having possibly cheaper gas from the West that started to exert pricing pressures. What you see here is essentially the cross-border import prices for Russian gas coming into Eastern Europe. And that is compared with the German water price, which is essentially the Russian gas import price, more or less the marker for pipeline gas into Europe from Russia. Interestingly, those prices started to emerge, and they went down. So in Central Eastern Europe, traders took opportunity of essentially the possibility of sourcing gas cheaper from the West to renegotiate contracts and deals with Russia. That's an interesting effect because it A, gives choice, and B, it produces consumer benefit. Now, let me quickly turn to the legal side of things because time is flying here. We have a big, thick book here called EU Energy Law, and that's essentially what has been in discussions for a long while concerning Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream, Russian gas in general, and obviously the whole EU energy gas market. The question is really to what extent Nord Stream 2 might be subject to that law and to the legal arrangement that has been found with a couple of energy packages since the 1990s. Now, if you follow public debates, then the idea is typically, Gazprom and anyone playing on the European market has to play according to EU rules. And that applies for Nord Stream 2 as well. Well, I would subscribe to the former, but not necessarily to the latter. Why is this? Well, first of all, I think it's not that straightforward. Nord Stream 2 is an offshore pipeline. And offshore pipelines are typically not governed by the EU energy regime. They're typically governed by the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, UNCLOS. And we have international governmental arrangements, agreements that would typically govern various aspects of those pipelines, including security aspects and maintenance and force majeure and environmental aspects and all these kind of things. And that's exactly why none of the Mediterranean import pipelines for gas from Libya, Algeria, and elsewhere would be subject to the EU energy regime. Pipelines from Norway are, but Norway is part of the EEA. That makes them subject to EU energy law. So I would argue there's a very hard case to make, a difficult case to make for Nord Stream 2 being part of the EU energy regime. But if you want to make that case, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of lawyers who do that, then you still got to answer a very pertinent question, which is, what kind of pipeline are we talking about? Are we talking about an interconnector, which is essentially, according to Article 34 of the 2009 Third Energy Package, it's a pipeline connecting two EU markets, more or less? I would argue that's the difficult case because Russia is not necessarily part of the EU. Or are you talking about an upstream pipeline, which is a pipeline that brings gas to market? If that's the case, then you got a problem, because upstream pipelines are exempted from Third Energy Package provisions. And they have to be certified by the country where the pipeline lands, in this case, Germany. So the point being, I think it's hard to make the case for Nord Stream 2 being part of the EU energy regime, but if you really want to make that case, you still got that problem of making the case for Nord Stream 2 being interconnector rather than an upstream pipeline. There's people making that argument saying, look, Nord Stream 2 goes through various economic zones of Denmark, of Sweden, of Germany, and Finland, but this, to me, might be still claims that are made on very shaky grounds. A slightly different story when it comes to the onshore extension. The onshore extensions are needed in order to bring gas to market. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have the pipeline land somewhere in Europe if you can't bring that gas to market. Nord Stream 1 is landing in Greifswald in Germany, is brought to market by Opal, a pipeline that many of you might have followed and around which you have a lot of important debates, legal debates. At the moment, where things stand, it's capped at 50% in terms of use. That's because of the third-party access requirement. We had some agreements in 2016 in December between the Commission, Gazprom, and to the effect that Gazprom could use 80%. That would require a whole bunch of changes, including certifying the pipeline operator. I don't want to bore you with the details, but it fell through because Poland and PGNiG, the Polish incumbent, objected against this. Now the case is in front of the European Court of Justice. So, point being, Opal is not used, and Nord Stream 1 not being fully used either because of that. Now, arguably, Gazprom has learned, having followed 8 years of back and forth on Opal, and the pipeline bringing Nord Stream 2 gas into Europe will not be Opal or Opal Plus. It will be a totally different pipeline, and it will be one that runs with a different regime. So here, essentially, you will have a pipeline that will be run by an a certified independent pipeline operator. It will separate sales from operation from production of gas. Essentially, boxes ticked. If you read the Third Energy Package and what it says, chances are that pipeline is going to be compliant with EU law. Now, you can poke holes into this, and EU law certainly is not kind of completely coherent, and it offers a lot of leeway for interpretation. But I think there's one thing that is dangerous if you start tinkering too much with the interpretation of the law, and particularly if you start applying it selectively, which means essentially you would politicize regulation. Regulation is there for making markets and making them work. And particularly in energy markets, it's about providing for a level playing field for anyone who plays on the EU market. Now, if you start kind of separating good molecules from bad molecules, you can do this, but you really, quite frankly, and pardon my French here, you get into Trump territory. You know, you would essentially say, look, this is good cars, this is bad cars, we want those, but we don't want that. And this is exactly what regulation should not be doing, because it is something that would politicize the regulatory authority, which is the Commission, and it would politicize the regulation itself. I have one more minute, so let me just finally get to Ukraine, which is a subject which is important in that debate. A lot of talk has been around the $2 billion of revenue that Ukraine would lose with Nord Stream 2, and that's a fact, and it's true. But what I did at some point is I just plotted the numbers of the discounts that Ukraine got because of the lower prices since, well, essentially 13, 14, 15, 16. So that's for 2015. If you do the numbers and the discounts that Ukraine got in terms of gas prices, and if you multiply this with the 16 BCM that Ukraine sources in 2015 from Russia, then you get you come up with a consumer benefit of around $1.1 billion. Now, that won't make up for those $2 billion in revenues, but it does one interesting thing, which is it shifts the benefit from the government and state coffers to consumers and industry, because the welfare benefit does not accrue, with the taxpayer, with the revenues and state budgets. It does accrue with the consumers, and that for a country that is ailing economically and has hard times getting back on its feet might not be the worst news. So, in all of this, to conclude, let me just quickly make 4 quick points. One, I think Nord Stream 2 might, from an economic point of view and a legal point of view, not be or from an economic point of view, it might not be that problematic. This doesn't do away with the politics, but there is consumer benefit. I would say the precondition to this is obviously a strong competition watchdog. You can't let molecules compete with molecules unless you have a strong competition authority in place. That's the Commission. You need interconnectors. We haven't talked about Southeastern Europe. That's a different case, and we might want to get to that because that's important in that context. But I think the selective or the strategic use of regulation is a bad idea. It's not something that you should be doing. And if Russian gas is too contested for security issues, which is a very important debate to have, and is not something I really want to kind of do away with here. But if Russian gas is too contested for security reasons, you got to deal with this in political terms, not with regulation, not with a strategic use of regulation, and not by politicizing the competition watchdog, which is the European Commission. And with that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks very much for your attention.